By the way, Dina, you look great. Just having a baby, and here you are already. Awesome. However, Randy has made it quite clear April and Dina will never be allowed back in Ohio again. They came back with a mother-in-law and a baby, and I am sympathetic with you. I sympathize with you greatly. Congratulations, that's wonderful. And we've got somebody beaming up here as well. It's not Ken, it's the individual next to him. She seems to be lighting up the world this morning. Ken's able to be with us. We're glad to have him here too. We are reading through the scriptures. If you haven't gotten your calendar for doing so, we have some in the back. Put it in the bulletin last week for November. This week we're supposed to read the first few chapters of Hebrews. So I wanted to go through a little bit of something from that, again, like we've been doing recently. We'll take the sermon from the scripture reading. How many of you in here have read Hebrews before? How many of you understood it before? A lot of hands disappeared, didn't they? Well, I'm here to tell you it's not that hard. Say, yeah, sure, Haskell. But it's not. The title of the lesson this morning is Jesus is Better. It's because I didn't have any imagination to be able to figure something else out. But that's really what the book of Hebrews is all about. Jesus is better. Now, particularly if we understand the history and the background of who he's talking to, the writer is writing to the Hebrew Christians. That means he's writing to Jewish Christians, isn't he? If he's writing to Jewish Christians, he's talking to them about what they're supposed to think of as important now and what it really means in the great scheme of things. Jesus is better. The Old Testament actually was pointing towards the Christ, wasn't it? The law of Moses was to bring people to the Christ. Now that the Christ is here, we have the better of everything. And he's going to go through systematically in Hebrews and show that. But what's interesting is where he starts. He starts by just doing a little quick summary of Jesus, and then he starts talking about him being better than the angels. So let's start this morning in Hebrews chapter 1 as we look at how the Holy Spirit tells us a little bit about this Jesus. Now, for those of you who live in America today, let me digress just a little bit. You live in America today, you're being inundated with advertisements that tell you something is better, right? Take this pill. Go to this city and live. Go to this university. Get this job. Wear these clothes. Have this computer. Have this phone. Get this phone. Get a life that's better. The whole idea of better is something that's so ingrained in advertising that it goes without saying. How many of you in here believe all the advertising you hear, though? He does. Ken does too, he says, yeah. They have no discerning ability at all. I tell you that if you take this pill, you're going to be the man you were 45 years ago. If you take this nutritional supplement, you will not die. Well, okay, maybe they don't quite say it that way, but that's almost what they say, isn't it? Well, I can tell you this, there is something that is better. But the better is not a pill, it's not a city, it's not an electronic device, it's not it's not a way of living in this world, except it's in Christ Jesus, it's in God himself. Hebrews chapter 1. In the past, I like the way he says that. Doesn't mean anything to me, but it would have meant a lot to the Hebrew people, wouldn't it? The Jews knew the past. Let's think about it for a minute here. Do you guys know your history? Oh, some of you do, okay. How long are we talking about here when he says in the past? Yeah, we don't know. We talking about a couple of years? A couple hundred years? A couple of thousand years? If the dating of the Exodus from Egypt is at about 14 or 1500 BC, then at the time this is written, there had been somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500 years gone by in which God had been dealing with the children of Israel as his people. Nod your head, yes, that's true. Okay. There had been at least that long. How far back do we have to go before we get to Abraham? Well, they were in Egyptian captivity for 400 years. And it wasn't Abraham that went into bondage, it was his descendants that went into bondage. So there's another 500 to 1,000 years on that, isn't there? In the past, God spoke. In the past means a lot to these people, doesn't it? This is not like in America where in the past meant, oh yeah, that building was built in 1953. No. Some of you guys have been to Europe, right? Did you get to some of those communities where they had a building that was built in 800 something? Or 1000 AD? Or 1100 something? I was in Aachen, Germany in 73. They have an octagonal cathedral there. And actually it has a throne inside that Charlemagne is supposed to have used as his seat when he went to church. Charlemagne died in 800, was it? 805, something like that. Anyway, it's been a while. That's an old building. It's still not old like what we're talking about here, though, isn't it? In the past. But notice what he says in the past. God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. God spoke to our forefathers. He's talking to the Hebrew people, isn't he? He's talking to people who are Hebrew in ethnic background. People who are Hebrew in religious background. People who are Jews by our definitions today. People who were the people of God, the chosen, the select, the uniquely chosen people of God before Christ came. He says God spoke to us in many different ways. He spoke to us through prophets. But there might have been different ways in which the prophets will receive that message. What are some of the ways they receive the message? Dreams, burning bushes, a donkey. You guys remember that one, right? Yeah. He did all kinds of different things to get the attention of the people, to get them to listen, to pay attention, to hear his word, to hear his message. But he would give them that message. Why is he saying that? It's a contrasting statement, isn't it? He wants to show you what he's done now. So, in the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. We'll go into what it means by his Son here in just a moment. But notice this, in these last days. By the way, guys, are we in the last days? Clearly so. Is that because Israel was formed as a nation in 1947, 1957, whatever date you want to use? No, that's not why. We're in the last days because Christ has come. We're in the last days because that's what God calls it, the last days. Now, how many of you expect the Lord to come in the next 5 minutes? By the way, I would be blessed if that's the case. I said, Haskell, your lesson's too good, we got to get rid of it now. That's not what he would be saying, though, is it? There have been a lot of preachers hope for that. Doesn't happen that way usually. But let me tell you something. Whether the Lord comes tonight or 1,000 years from tonight, your responsibility does not change, does it? God has spoken to us in his Son. Whether we lived at the time the Hebrew writer wrote this in the first century, or we live today, or we live in the future and the Lord hasn't come yet, our responsibility is still the same. Now, who is this Jesus that he's telling us that God speaks to us through? He spoke to us today in these last days in his Son. Well, first of all, it's the Son, isn't it? He's going to make an issue of that as we go through this. He's going to call him Son. In fact, he's going to compare the angels with him and say, who among the angels did he call my Son? Who among the angels did he say, sit here while I put your enemies under your feet? Who among you as angels did he say, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased? Jesus is first and foremost the Son of God, isn't he? All right, let's see what he says about that. Whom he appointed heir of all things. Whom he appointed heir of all things. That is a given position, isn't it? That's a given ability. God had to give him that right. Well, now what about us? We're told that we become joint heirs, don't we? Country preacher boy was reading that once and said joint hire. I think he kind of missed it, but joint heirs with Christ. But God gave him that becoming an heir. And then he says, and through whom he made the universe. In Genesis chapter 1 it says, and God created the heavens and the earth. It goes on from there to describe that creation. In John chapter 1 it says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the same was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that has been made. And then he tells us who that Word is. In verse 14 he says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. The unique Son of God, the one whom he says here he has spoken to us, through whom he speaks to us today. Any of you guys receive a special message from God in your dreams last night? It was indigestion if you did. Just a suggestion, take some Rolaids or something beforehand. We don't receive visions like that. Sometimes we feel like they could be visions, but he gave us the last messages through his Son. We can go through in other places to show that, but we're not going to spend the time on that this morning. Just understand, God chose different ways to talk through the prophets in the past, but today he has spoken to us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Verse 3, the Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. The Son is the radiance of God's glory. I like some of the old translations. They use words that we've never heard before. American Standard Version of 1901. The Son is the effulgence of God's glory. Anybody in here know what effulgence means? I'll give you a hint. In the New International, it says what? Radiance. Yeah, there's a smart guy. He may be a country boy, but he's smart, huh? Yeah. Just because they use a word that we don't use doesn't mean we have to have trouble understanding it. You got some newer translations. It tells us what it means. The word effulgence means brightness or radiance. Here they've chosen to use the word radiance of God's glory. But the whole point of it is Jesus is the Christ, the brightness of God in our lives. He's the light of the world, isn't he? No matter how you want to describe that, he's that light. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. I'm an artist. I'm a literal artist. I don't do the modern art where I make things symbolically look like something. And when I draw a face, it looks exactly like a face. Now, if those of you know my art know that my art is a round circle, a couple of dots for eyes. Not very good representation, is it? I've seen some of the artists, though, who could do an exact representation. And I've seen artists that have been able to do so for a long time who would actually do a portrait that was as good as any photograph we can take today. Have you seen some of those? Pretty amazing stuff, isn't it? God says that Jesus, his Son, is the exact representation of his image. Some of the things we heard Jesus and his disciples talked about. They said, show us the Father. And Jesus' response was what? What? I've been with you this long and you still don't recognize me? You can't tell that I'm him, huh? You've seen me, you've seen the Father. That's right. The exact representation of his image. All right, so I know what God looks like now. I've seen pictures in Sunday school. He's a Caucasian, handsome young man with brown hair, blue eyes. It has to be blue eyes, doesn't it? I don't know. I'm joking, of course. We don't know what his picture was. We don't have an image of it. The Jews were forbidden to take images like that, either in stone or in gold or in silver or anything else. They were forbidden to actually cut those images because they were considered related to idolatry. And I tell you what, if we had an image of Christ right now, actually somebody could say, here's the provenance of this sculpture, and it would come down to us in exact formation. We'd look at that and say, there's the image of God, and what would we be doing to it? Huh? Worshipping it? Robert, you would worship it?
That's what would happen.
Oh, that's what would happen. Yeah. Yeah. I tell you what, I say I would not, but wouldn't you think there would be a certain amount of awe in being in the presence of an image like that? Knowing that this is not just the image of Jesus the Christ, but it's the image of God himself. But by the way, is that what it means when it says that he's the exact image of God? That's not what it means, is it? He doesn't talk about the color of his hair, the color of his skin, the color of his eyes. He's not talking about the shape of his face, the fact that he has 2 eyes instead of 3. Well, don't laugh. You know, we have all kinds of imagination. They're still eyes, but put one right there too, right? I saw Twilight Zone with one right there. It must be true. All right. The idea that God is able to be represented in a physical form is something that goes all the way back to the creation. In the creation it says, let us make man in our own image. Now, what does that mean? We've discussed it, we've argued it. Man has historically given all kinds of definitions to what that means and have even fought some wars over it. What is the image of God? The fact is, this body, being a bilateral body, physiologically expressed with 2 lungs, 2 feet, 2 legs, 2 eyes, 2 arms, is not what he's talking about. On the other hand, the spiritual body is, isn't it? I can definitely say the spiritual side is what he's referring to, without necessarily at that point being able to point to the body and say it's not like him, because I don't know. Except, in John chapter 4, it says very plainly, Jesus, in responding to the woman at the well in Samaria, says that God is not made of flesh and bone. God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. But nevertheless, Jesus is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by the word of his power. That's where he begins, sustaining all things by the word of his power. When we tried to split the atom, New Mexico has a history there, since the splitting of the atom didn't occur first here, but in use as a weapon it did, in the weaponizing of it. We found out it wasn't as easy to do as we thought. Why? Because there's a bond holding it together, isn't there? Now, once it was released, it was a huge amount of energy that was released. But there was a bond holding it together. I'm not going to tell you that they had to break the bonds of God in order to break that atom open. But to some extent, I am saying that, aren't I? Jesus is upholding everything by the word of his power. I'll put it from another standpoint. We're told that when everything is over, it's all going to be burned up. Right? Is that the terminology? It's going to be rolled up like a scroll, burned up. How do you open a scroll? You hold it open with your hands, don't you? What happens when you let go? It kind of goes back together again, doesn't it? It rolls back up. Jesus is upholding all things by the word of his power. Not only did he create the universe, not only did God use him through whom he created the universe, but right now God is using him to hold that universe together. When's the end going to be? I don't know. I can make an argument that God knows that Jesus doesn't know even still. Maybe he does by now, but he tells his disciples when he was here, he didn't know, only God knew. But if Jesus, let's use this literally for a moment. Jesus is the one holding the universe together. God says, now. Does that work for you? Maybe, I don't know. Works for me. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. He made purification for sins. How did he do that? By living the life he lived, a life of obedience, a perfect life that would allow him to become the perfect sacrifice, and thus he became the better sacrifice, didn't he? We're told later in Hebrews, the blood of bulls and goats could not take away the sin, but the blood of Jesus did. We have someone who's better in every way. That's quite a description of him he gives here, isn't it? Very quickly, let's just finish out a little bit more in this, where he says then, so he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. We have a fad with angels in recent times. Angels this, angels that. Put an angel on your windshield or the dashboard of your car. Put it on the mantle in your living room. Put it on the lapel of your coat. Angels. I like angels. Especially the cherubs in Valentine's, those cute little fat babies with diapers and little red cheeks. Don't forget the cherubim were what he put at the Garden of Eden at the gate to keep man out. And there was a flaming sword there. The presumption being they could use that sword. I don't think they're the cute little Valentine's babies at all. But Jesus has a name better than theirs. Jesus has become better than them by his obedience, by what he has done. You are my son. Today I have become your father. Psalm 2, verse 7. Jesus is better than even the angels. We're told, we're cautioned actually, warned. Galatians chapter 1 says, if we or even an angel from heaven come preaching a gospel different than what you've received, let him be anathema, let him be accursed. That's how powerful Jesus is, how important Jesus is. The message of Jesus has been given, and it is a message about the Son of God in our lives today. Now, how many of you believe the advertisements that this pill will make you better, this wife will make you better? By the way, anybody in here gone to any of the dating sites online? Never mind, don't raise your hand. I guarantee you, Christ is the only one that will make us better. Why? Because he's better. There's nothing on this earth that has anything to offer us. Oh yeah, but we're earthly beings ourselves, aren't we? People of flesh. People who have desires of the flesh. And as a result, that will make me happy. Some poor country boy marries a pretty girl from the city and has a miserable life, but he got the prize. Not that you girls are not the prize, forgive me. Or the poor girl does the same thing. I got the prize, and that guy turned out to be a jerk. You ever hear that you're supposed to marry a Christian? Or better yet, typically in Oklahoma and Texas, we said, you need to marry a member of the church. Friends, I don't believe that. I think you need to marry a Christian. Actually, I think I'd say it a little bit differently than that even. You need to marry someone who will help you get to heaven. And then you need to be the kind of person that will help them get to heaven. And you say, well, that's saying the same thing. Yeah, sort of. Just because you're sitting in that pew doesn't make you a Christian, does it? Just because we're in here claiming to be Christians doesn't make us the followers of the Son of God. He is better. He's worth following. He's worth committing to. He's worth giving our all to. And yet, we live in the flesh thinking that, well, we can just put a lapel pin on and say, I follow Christ, and that's all there is to it. Now, Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. If you want to be my disciple, then wherever I am, there you will be also. My goodness, he traveled a rough course, didn't he? What is the course that you're following in your life? If Jesus really is better in your life, what are you doing to show that? How is that demonstrated in your life? By the way, I'm thankful for your all presence this morning. I hope you come back. Hope I didn't make you too mad. But the fact is, your being here means nothing if you're not here for the right reasons. Jesus is the right reason. Haskell's not. Jesus is the right reason in everything. When I was young, a Sunday school teacher would ask a question and I'd give the answer back. It never varied. I had one answer for everything. And it wasn't because I was wise, it was because I didn't know any better. She says, what's the answer to this question? I'd say, God. What's the answer to that question? God. And then she'd ask me another question. Can you guess what the answer was? Yeah. Well, I was a little kid, I didn't know any better. But you know what? There's some wisdom in that, isn't there? God's the answer. Not that magic pill. Not that city that's inviting you to come and be a part of their community. Not that special development with those beautiful houses And that nice recreational facilities in the neighborhood, the golf club, the parks, the pool, that's not what makes life. It's not heaven on earth. It's Christ in us. Read the book of Hebrews. Understand it better and how it affects your life. What it means that Jesus is better. I pray that you would have something in your life that you could hold up and just like the light that Jesus talks to him about, that we didn't hide under a basket but actually put on a hill to shine to the world. I hope that's the way your life is. But if for some reason that light is dimmed, either it's tarnished because of sin in your life, or if you've never come to Christ, who is the answer to everything in your life, we invite you to come right now while we stand and while we sing.